Hello, welcome to the New Stack Makers, a podcast where we talk about at-scale application development, deployment, and management.
Continuing our coverage of Open Source Summit here at LA Live Convention Center at the JW Marriott in Los Angeles. I'm Scott Fulton, but you didn't come to see me today. You came to see this gentleman, the legendary network engineer Ken Owens, presently with Mastercard, previously one of the legendary engineers at Cisco. Good to see you again, my brother.
Thanks, guys. Good to be here. Always enjoy talking and meeting with the New Stack.
We were chatting a little bit before we went live on air here about some of the things that you've had an opportunity to see here so far, and you've kind of taken, you've gauged the customer and the attendee interest right now in certain of the sessions that were here, and taking note of the technological sessions and the more lessons learned sessions, you said. And you find that there's a bit of an imbalance.
Yeah, I think you kind of asked me what have I seen here that was really interesting, right? And to be honest, there's not much that's great interest to me here other than just meeting with the people and talking with people here that I need to meet with and talk with.
So the headline, there's nothing of interest going on here. I'm Scott Fulton with the New Stack. Take care.
In attending some of the sessions, though, I guess when you're in the field, you're so busy working on the new solution, the new project, trying to put all this together, and you're so in depth in like all the bits and bytes and the value that you want to bring to the business that you sort of lose sight of the other side of that, are the practitioners that need to implement, run, and operate this day two, right? It's easy. I always say it's easy to build something new. It's a lot harder to build it in a way that you can run and operate it day two. And what I've learned here in my transition from Cisco to Mastercard, because I was out of the enterprise for about 10 years now, from Savvis to Cisco, now back to the enterprise space. They have a day job running the business, right? And they remind me of that all the time, that they don't get to go play with cool new technology like I do because they have to run a business. And so what I've noticed, to your point that you asked me when I started going to the sessions here, the sessions on lessons learned are the most well attended, because I think for the most part, when you're running a business, you don't have time to try to figure this out on your own. You want to learn from what other people have done. You want to start with the lessons that they've learned as you began, so you don't make those same mistakes and you have a little bit of a head start going forward, right?
So you think this imbalance in session attendance that you've noted, it's not due to people already knowing what this new technology is, or pretty much already having been up to speed on this. You feel that right now there's a little tentativeness still in the air?
I think there's a lot of tentativeness, and I think there's a lot of where do I start, right? If you look at just in the space I'm representing, cloud native, there are hundreds of projects and companies doing cloud native solutions. And so the first question you have to ask when you're in the enterprise is, okay, which of these do I care about? Which of these do I want to learn more about? And when you don't have time to really go out and learn a whole lot new, you want to kind of start with the subset of what other enterprises are using today. You want to learn from what other enterprises have done. So you start with that as your foundation, and you can always add to that foundation with other interesting technologies, projects, or vendor solutions that you work with. But you don't really know where to begin until you sort of get that foundational piece worked out.
Is it because these cloud native technologies were born from institutions that structurally and in terms of enterprise, what they do for a living, are so fundamentally different from what everyone else does for a living? For instance, Google, right. Netflix.
Exactly.
That they built a model that works for them, and they adapted it a couple of times, so that it's a little more general purpose. It's not just for Google, but maybe it isn't quite yet for a financial institution, an insurance company, an underwriter, somebody who has a very specific user base.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the case, right? There are purpose-built cloud apps that were built in the cloud for the cloud, are much different than traditional enterprise applications that have been built over the last 3-4 decades to support and run financial systems, to support and run healthcare systems, to support and run, the transportation systems of the country, right? And so, in the same way that, the business was designed at like a Google and a Facebook and an Uber for a very specific business model, the enterprises now are faced with this question of how do we transform? How do we go from where we're at today, that is a business model that doesn't scale, that isn't going to support this next generation of users that we're trying to go after? How do we transform that business model, not necessarily to go and build our own new data center like a Google would do, right? Or like a Facebook would do, but our application developers, and a conference like this does a great job of application developers on what they need to do, how they need to take advantage of these new technologies. It doesn't really focus yet specifically on what are the use cases for the enterprise to make that transformation. How do enterprises go from where they're at to supporting this new cloud-native development model? And that's where I think these lesson learned have been very well attended, because that's where the enterprise wants to know what have these enterprises and what have other enterprises done to accomplish what that first step was. Because once you get that, as you know, once you get that first step, you just keep iterating on top of that after that, right? It's just getting that first piece done is so tough.
Have you encountered any enterprises that perhaps deserve what I will call the Golden Canary Award? Maybe the companies that took the plunge, that went into the coal mine early, and came out with enough lessons learned, bad or good, that that would be probably the most valuable things that could be taught here.
Yeah, I think the ones that I've worked with and have seen at events like this that are very, very important to talk to are companies like SAP, IBM, the BMWs and the Volkswagens of that type of use cases. I know Walmart has done an awesome job as well, and you hear those stories quite a bit. On the New Stack, I was on a conversation with somebody Alex had brought in from, I think, Capital One. And so I know that Capital One, those guys have been doing a good job of trying to transform in the financial services industry some of the development and products that they're trying to produce out in the cloud as a new cloud native pattern. And so there's good success stories out there. And this is the kind of conference you come to learn about those success stories, where you can meet and talk with these individuals that have done this, have gone through that transformation, at least one version of it, and have successfully succeeded at what they were trying to do.
You're a network engineer by trade. Is there the potential for a kind of intermediate platform that we haven't yet realized, that could be something that exists in that intermediate layer between the current orchestration platforms or current platforms as a service and where enterprises are today, that perhaps reaches even more towards them, not more than maybe just a current cloud service provider would do, to help them along that transition space? I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily it's something that exists today and you're already aware of an idea, but is there a potential for something that we have yet to build that would meet them closer than we already are?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of interesting ideas I've been pushing here. The first one is working with vendors like Cisco that have relationships with the cloud providers to offer up certifications that tie the cloud deployments and network certifications together. And so, Cisco has the CCIE program, and within that CCIE program, they added last year a cloud engineer to that. And so you can start learning more about that. Cisco also did something called DevNet, which is a whole environment around helping to train network admins and network practitioners to be more software-defined networking and be ready for that. So there are two good examples of the industry that need things that can happen in the industry that if the cloud providers would support that as well and kind of offer their networking certifications to enterprise network engineers that want to learn how to do networking in their cloud stronger and better and more aligned with how they do things, that would help quite a bit, I think.
So you see something more of an educational platform, not just a technological platform. If we brought certification into it, if we brought more human interaction, get more teaching going on,
right,
and help people, give them a ladder to climb, some rules to follow, they'll follow them.
I think so. That's been my experience to date. The other side of that, what I'm seeing happening a lot is what I kind of call the VMware model, right? I shouldn't call it the VMware model because it has nothing to do with VMware, but I call it the VMware model because it's what it makes me think of, right? And that is, what I've seen happening at most enterprises, they take what they have on-prem, right? So they take their Cisco switch, their checkpoint firewall, their F5 load balancing, and they go into the cloud provider and they go to the marketplace. They go, oh, look, I can buy that checkpoint firewall, and I can buy this this load balancer, and I can buy this route, and I can deploy that in my cloud.
There used to be one-to-one correspondence.
Exactly. Now, so that to me is sort of this intermediate step that you're referring to. That's what sort of is happening right now, where they're building what they have on-prem in the cloud. And in my opinion, that's just a horrible thing to do for several reasons. But the two biggest ones are the versioning of what's in the cloud versus what you support on-prem are usually never the same, and how you manage the upgrades and the feature releases between a cloud solution. Because now it's, in the enterprise, if you wanted a new service or a new feature, you work with your vendor to get that feature. Now you have to add the third-party clouds in there to say, hey, now I need you, Mr. Cloud Provider, to support this same feature from this same version from this vendor in your marketplace, which makes it a much more complicated
And interfacing is no longer a two-way affair.
It's
you
not.
have to go through some kind of hub.
Yeah, and like in the case of Mastercard, we're using two clouds to begin with, so now I have to do that twice. I have to get both of my cloud providers to support that. And if you look at, nCloud, which is a dream I think every enterprise has, where you have, more than 2 or 3 providers you can work with, now you have to basically replicate that same model with all of them. And it's not easy to do, as you know, right? So that to me is one thing. The one that I think is more appropriate for our discussion, though, is you don't want to take bad habits that you've created in the enterprise and move them into the cloud, right? If you're doing what you're doing today, which isn't going to get your business where you want to go, why would you ever want to replicate that into a cloud? If it's not meeting your needs today, it's not going to meet your needs in the cloud, right? The cloud isn't magical, right? It doesn't make pixie dust and make things just appear and work well because it's in a cloud.
So a lot of the answer to the question, what do I containerize or what do I move to the cloud first, can best be answered by solving the problem. What do I refrain from containerizing?
Right.
What can I stop right here? What part of the workload can I get off my shoulders so we can actually have time to start thinking about something?
Exactly, right.
Now, as you reminded us, you're now an engineer with a financial organization. And it is impossible to turn on the news in between the news of our friends in Houston and Florida to hear, not to hear the news about the people who are being affected by the latest tremendous breach of identities on the part of Equifax. And I'm wondering, you understand the architecture of identity and networking better than most anyone. Can you say with any confidence that had Equifax employed the types of architectures that are being featured here at Open Source Summit, more containerization, more dev tests separate from production, more Kubernetes, can you say with any confidence that that could have prevented the types of breaches that we've seen here?
I don't believe it would have prevented the type of breaches we've seen here. I think there's a scope of that question, right? And so if you implement the containerization and cloud native strategy the way you should implement it, right? you would have your identity split up across multiple different services. And you would only have pieces of those identities in those services. So if you were to compromise one service, you would have only one small piece of the overall identity. And with that small piece, you couldn't really do anything, and it would have been encrypted. So to decrypt it would have taken a lot of time, right? And so in this example, I think this is a good example, and I want to know more over the coming weeks of exactly what happened here, right? But I believe this is another interesting trend that we're seeing, which is as you move things to the cloud and you're moving your best practices that you have on-prem to the cloud, you're putting all of your identities in one store. You're putting the key to that identity in the same location as those keys, or you're not even encrypting that data because you're not worried about the encryption because it's, you don't think this is going to happen to you, right? And so, and then as users of services, we're so used to clicking that accept button every time it pops up on, when they're telling you that, hey, you're about to do something you shouldn't do. Are you sure it's okay for us to accept this identity? Or you're okay with us giving you this service? We all say yes. I think those two pieces together go back to leveraging the technology that's on display here in the right way, right? Which is separating those roles, responsibilities, keep your RBAC controls in place as you move to the cloud. I think too often we give too much access to individuals in a cloud deployment that don't really have the need to have access to that information. And I think we make it way too easy in that transport stream for people to just get in there and say, I am a consumer of this service, I'm giving you my data, and then we pass information across that string that lets those hackers understand how they can then get data out of that system by calling the same API with a get instead of a put, right? And these are not hard techniques for hackers to pick up on, right? These are things that they've been doing for years. And so if we don't do a better job of, isolating and keeping our attack surfaces small, which is what the promise of containerization is, right? We can keep our attack surface much smaller, then I think it would be possible in the future to be a much more secure with identities than we are today. But it really depends on how we break those identities into different services, how we make sure that they're encrypted, that the key is not available in the same place that you're putting your services, right? The key management aspect and the security aspect of those models become really, really important. And, for instance, in the financial institutions I've worked at, those identities are locked behind air gaps that are in the enterprise that no one's going to get access to, right? And so that's the reason why I think something like this happening at this scale has always been a concern of many financial services institutions, because there's a lot of data that you're maintaining. People are trusting you with this data, and if you allow, by either design or by just architecture flaw, an opening that you didn't think would be exposed, that's never a good excuse to give the public, right?
A security engineer once explained it to me this way. He said, it is the scale that is the problem. The larger and more centralized the database, by nature, almost directly, the less secure it is. And the tendency I've seen in recent years in explaining the way that stateful services would be implemented in a containerized environment is to implement a kind of a stateful sets relationship between any number, thousands, tens of thousands of isolated namespaced containers, and this single large, broad database that we've had to begin with. And it seems like if we did it that way, we're really only postponing the solving of the problem until later.
Yep.
Is there any effort that you see to do what you've said to help break down that gargantuan database component into smaller subsets that can be virtualized to look like it's one gargantuan?
Yeah, there's quite a few things going on. One of the technologies I'm looking at is Hyperledger, because I think you could kind of use a ledger to sort of be an intermediate layer between your identity keys and the users that are consuming or requesting that service.
Hyperledger.
It's using blockchain technology. So the other piece then is as you look at those identities, there's sort of this AAA, the authentication, access, and authorization, right? That those 3 A's still matter in the cloud, right? And so what we're doing and what most institutions are trying to do to address this issue is we're looking at our authentication systems have to be smaller, they have to be more distributed in nature, and they have to be tied back into roles that are really roles that you only are allowed, you're only authorized to do what you should be able to do with your title, right? With the capabilities that you've been given by the enterprise for managing that system. You're locked down to what you can do there. The third part then is the encryption of that data and the separation of that key management separation from that data. Because the key is what is really important in all of this, right? You don't want that key to be something that is easily picked out, right? And in the case of with Equifax, I don't believe they had any kind of management of keys or encryption of this data because it was pretty easily obtained, right? We'll find out more in the coming days. It would appear that way. And so managing the data, keeping it, knowing that it's PII data, knowing that you need to secure that data, we're looking at encryption capabilities that are allowing us to basically encrypt everything, including the key, keep the key management separate from the encryption mechanisms.
So smaller authentication services, and instead of centralizing them, instead of having these big things,
make them distributed.
I would think if you're doing this under service discovery, you would need some type of a service discovery mechanism that could point a request to an authentication service to any of these small services.
And you have to secure that service discovery component. And so what we're doing is we're embedding security within all of our services we deploy, and I call it security of things. So there's a authentication that needs to happen between the service discovery mechanism.
If I had a whiteboard, SOT, security of things.
And the services that are associating between those two, because I don't want to trust, by nature, we should not trust any service trying to connect to us, right? Our goal should be, like it is with humans, we don't trust this service. We need you to authenticate to us who you are. And so, and so when I talk about this model, it's definitely a encrypted authentication mechanism is needed between the services as well, so that we can authenticate that service is really the service that it says it is. And it's not just some random service that got spun up on the internet and is able to talk through some port that we've opened up for an API to talk over, right? And and that's another idea as well that we have is we don't use any API ports, any common ports and protocols for authentication, right? We're leveraging what would not be N-band type of communication, so you couldn't just sit there on a HTTP header and be able to pick out how do you communicate to our authentication service, right? That's all in the back-end systems that we don't expose to anyone.
Now we're at an open source summit, so we have the community here. There's no excuse for not communicating. How do we start the process of communicating what you've just said to the security community, which by and large is still kind of comprised of a consortium of commercial software providers?
I think it starts with having that conversation at events like this. It starts by going to the security events like Black Hat and like RSA and trying to pull in that community. And there's been a lot of efforts done there. The blockchain efforts that are going on are pretty impressive in terms of how that community is coming together. Cloud Security Alliance, CSA, has still done a pretty good job of pulling together a lot of these independent security companies that don't like to work with each other. And so I think that effort has been undergoing, but I think the Linux Foundation, in the same way that they've embraced network and helped push network into the open community, we need to do the same thing, I think, here with security. Get security into the Linux Foundation and start pushing out the new security capabilities needed in this new model.
Do we create a kind of a department within the Linux Foundation that handles security?
I mean, I would look at it as like a foundation.
Or does it interface with somebody that's already there who doesn't realize that they could be utilized?
Yeah, I think it'd be good to have a foundation, a set of foundations around some of these topics, right? Not necessarily it has to be a foundation, but there's not really an existing group within the Linux Foundation that can handle this type of topic or that would have the expertise in this area.
How would it interface, if you will, with, as you mentioned, the Cloud Security Alliance?
Yeah. So what we do in the Linux Foundation today is we have liaisons into these other organizations, and the way you kind of look at them as they're sort of like a partnership almost, right? We don't want to try to replicate what's being done somewhere else, right? But we want to sort of fill this gap that is not being addressed anywhere, and we'd like for partner organizations to point to us for those areas and say, for this area, you should go talk with the Linux Foundation group. They're working on this. And if somebody came to me and said, hey, how about audit? How do we manage audit in the cloud? I would point them to Cloud Security Alliance, so they handle audit and how you should do audits in the cloud, right? And so I don't think the Linux Foundation should try to address that because that's already being addressed somewhere else. And so I think they've done a very good job with like the IETF and with other large groups within the industry that have standards and have groups that are doing things already. And I think we just follow that same model and we try to push the Linux Foundation and these other organizations to work together in the same way.
In our last few minutes, project, if you will, Open Source Summit 2018. What would you like to see discussed on the agenda next year that would give you an indication that this industry is maturing at the rate and the level that it should be?
I think there are two top things I'd be looking for. The first one is more enterprise involvement, right? I'd like to see more enterprises presenting the lessons learned and the obstacles that they're facing and that they need help with, right? So that's the first thing I'd like to see is more enterprises engaged. And I say that because I think enterprises are struggling with open source technology and how they manage it, how they integrate it into their business, how they support it, how they work with the community, right? It's new to enterprises, and so I think that would be helpful. And along those same lines, I guess the Linux Foundation would be good to have some sessions on enterprise adoption of open source and best practices for how you manage open source within a community when you're in an enterprise, right? So that's one area. The second area, I think, is just the tremendous growth in the Cloud Native Foundation over the last 2 years. And things like blockchain and Hyperledger started like after the CNCF, so I'm not sure how well they've been growing, but it would be great to see that continued growth in cloud native technologies, more certifications that we've seen announced this week, maybe some network certifications that are tied into that, and CNA more security topics. Those types of things would be, I think, really, really important for 2018 Open Source Summit.
So once again, bringing people more into an educational process that can get their skills built, that can give them some foundation to work with so that they can go back to their enterprises and say, okay, now I know what step one looks like.
Exactly.
Ken, always a pleasure to be with you.
Definitely.
Ken Owens, security engineer, network engineer at Mastercard. Always good to have you.
Thanks. Have a good day.
From the Open Source Summit in Los Angeles, I'm Scott Fulton for the New Stack.
Listen to more episodes of the New Stack Makers at thenewstack.io/podcast. Please rate and review us on iTunes, like us on YouTube, and follow us on SoundCloud. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.